hoping that we've reached a turning point in human history. We can't carry on acting like this big, clever ape that has the right of dominion over all other life and land. And we have at last recognised that we're at a tipping point in climate history where we need to act really fast to save the biosphere as we know it. This is now in the news at last, and you'll know that alongside reducing emissions, the single other most important thing we must do is to try and save as many other species as possible. Extinction rates are terrifying, complicated but terrifying. But the good news is there are numerous multilateral initiatives to support, to restore and to reverse biodiversity loss. But in order to act, we need to measure biodiversity. How do we do that? How do we measure the biodiversity of the planet, of the Amazon rainforest? Well, let's quickly check what do we mean by biodiversity. Biodiversity is quite abstract in itself, but it refers roughly to some measure of the number of species in a particular place at a particular time. So traditionally, ecologists put on their Wellington boots and they went into the field and they measured the moss and the trees and they counted the birds and the bees and they tallied them all up and did a little bit of maths and they had a number that was the biodiversity for that place. So that works fine. I can do it here. There's 2 olive trees. That's quite simple. Maybe in the Attenborough Centre garden we can do that, but across the Amazon rainforest, how do we do that? There aren't enough people, for a start, that even know the species there, never mind the time and the resources to orchestrate this. So some people have been exploring remote sensing using satellites or drones to take photographs of canopy cover, for example. And this can be really useful. We can assess very rapidly over vast tracts of land the cover of a forest and maybe even identify some of the species, and that can be really useful. But what we don't know is what's running around on the floor of the forest or swimming around on the floor of our oceans or rivers. So how else might we assess the health of our forests and our oceans? Well, we can maybe think a bit laterally. How do we assess the health of our own bodies? We're, after all, a complex biological system. As you'll all know, for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, physicians have listened to our hearts and our lungs and our intestines to check their health. And in the last few years, ecologists have started doing the same thing to assess the health of ecosystems. My name's Alice Eldridge, and I want to tell you a little bit in the next 10 minutes about the theory underlying how we can listen to biodiversity, and also to share with you some examples of the work that we've been doing at Sussex across schools to validate this as a method for monitoring biodiversity at a very grassroots level, working very closely with communities who live in these biodiversity hotspots across the world. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with bird song, whale song, maybe crickets chirping, maybe even in Brighton, if you live in Brighton, the sound of vixen on heath screaming. We're all familiar with the sounds that creatures make, and we're largely familiar with the idea that for a lot of animals, sound is critical to survival. It's nothing new. So let's think this through a little bit, pretend we're going to be like a quick evolutionary lecture. Let's think this through in evolutionary terms. So if we need to be heard to survive, because otherwise we can't meet our mate, right? Then if we can't be heard above maybe the sounds of other species, or wind, or rain, or rivers, or cars, or aeroplanes, or boats, then probably we won't meet our mate, and we might die. And if enough of us die, then the species dies out. Okay? More positively, if we can be heard, if our voice is heard above the soundscape, above all the sounds that are happening in that place, then we have a much higher chance of meeting our mate. We may reproduce, and our children will have a song that's a little bit like ours. Okay? So that's at the individual level. We're sort of happy with that. Let's think now to the community level, to the chorus, the whole dawn chorus, if you like, whether that's for the birds or the fish. So if there's all these animals evolving so that their voice can be heard, then that means their voices are co-evolving to kind of coexist and weave together nicely, yeah? So just as in a good orchestration for an orchestral symphony work, or even a well-mixed dance track, depending on what music you're into, we have a complex number of voices, but they're coordinated. They don't overlap each other. Each voice has its distinct place, yeah? And so what we're suggesting is that this happens in the natural ecosystems as well. And we can take this one step further. In these kind of pristine environments of the forest, there are so many species. The more species we have, the more competition there is, the more we're kind of forced apart in these acoustic niches. So maybe the wider the range of frequencies. The musical analogy again, string quartet, not much difference between the cello and the violin, symphony orchestra, double bass, piccolo. Okay, even if you're not a musician, you get the idea. And sure enough, this is what we get. We're listening to the sound of the dust chorus in the Ecuadorian rainforest. So it's the western part of the Amazon, eastern part of Ecuador. And we're looking at a spectrogram representation of the same sound file. So this is a really useful tool in audio research. Time is on the bottom, frequency is up the top, and there's kind of a heat map. So the brighter areas, there's more energy. And you can hear the frogs down the bottom, the there's some beep, 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 kind of little frogs down the bottom. There's some the orthoptera, so the katydids, you can hear the mid-frequencies. Every so often we hear some broadband cicadas, this noise. And I don't know if maybe there's a few people here who are young enough to be able to hear the bottom end of the bats. Most of us have lost the top end of our hearing. But the point is, these different species, this was in the Guarani territory in Ecuador, so it's a primary forest, but it's not the most pristine on the planet. But even here, we see this frequency banding. Each species has its own frequency range, this idea of a kind of an acoustic niche. Okay? So I first read about these ideas. Quite a hippie guy who used to play the korg in the Doors band. Then he wrote this slightly out there paper back in the 90s, suggesting this idea of an acoustic niche. And at the time, everyone said, "Don't be ridiculous." And I read about this in 2002. I was at Sussex studying evolutionary and adaptive systems, but I was also I grew up playing music, and I was really blown away because I thought, okay, so what we're saying is that sound is a core component in evolution, just like habitat and food. And therefore that the soundscape, this kind of image, the sound we were hearing, is a kind of ecological record. So we're happy with the fossil record. Yeah, it tells us about the hard-bodied things that lived in the past. The soundscape tells us about the soniferous species, the things that make a noise here now in the present. Yeah, so this is the kind of a record of the way that things interact with each other. So 10 years later, I was back at Sussex, having done a PhD in computer science, and quit for a bit, played the cello for a bit, came back, and in a chance conversation in the Bridge Cafe, I bumped into my old capoeira teacher. He happened to be a conservation biologist, and he was really concerned at that time with saving the brown-headed spider monkey in Ecuador. So very grassroots, very applied. And so for him, saving the monkey means saving the trees, but saving the trees means finding another income for the people who cut down the trees for their income. And he was managing to do this, but he needed to evidence his good work. And so he was exploring this drone technologies as a way of canopy assessment, and came across this problem. Well, but we don't know if there's anything on the forest floor. So he was interested in rapid assessment tools, and I was teaching music informatics, showing students how to, recognize what a percussion instrument was using machine listening. And I thought, well, if we can do musical machine listening, then we can do ecological machine listening. And probably if we can do it quickly enough, cheaply enough, with simple enough algorithms, we could probably do it on a phone even, and make a network of upcycled mobile phones across the Amazon, get this intimate soundscape, but at a scalable resolution. So a really good example of why we must have more coffee breaks at work. So in 2014, we got our first grant from Sussex RDF to go and explore these ideas. So we set off to the Amazon and worked in the Sussex Downs as well. And what we wanted to show was that this sort of machine listening to biodiversity, a kind of digital stethoscope, could do the same job as the ornithologist in the field counting the birds. Okay? So when you make a new tool, you have to compare it to the old tool. So over 2014, several months we spent in the field. So it's a mix of very muddy field work and then huge data collection, big data crunching on the high-performance computer cluster, loads of muddy multivariate stats on the other side. So quite an interesting combination of work. So we spent 3 months. This guy's Nenke. He was the chief of a Guarani settlement that were our hosts in the eastern Ecuador. These people are actually considered quite dangerous by the taxi drivers of Quito, who warned us that someone had been killed recently, several white people. But they were the shamanic forest society, and they knew that we were concerned with saving the forest. So they were our guides, which was really helpful because there's lots of other much more dangerous things in the forest. So we spent 3 months setting up networks of these recorders, these green boxes. You can program them, you strap them to a tree, and they record every 5 minutes, every 15, round the clock, this kind of thing. We set up a grid of those, covering about 1 kilometre square, and across a range of habitats. So we looked at pristine, ancient forests in England, regenerating farmland, and intensely farmed land, and the same in Ecuador. So the idea is we're looking at a gradient of habitat, so we see a gradient of birds, and then we got some ornithologists to listen to the samples. And cut a very long story short, the same pattern we saw in bird species variation, we saw in our digital stethoscope, the mass that we did on the audio file. So essentially this work that we did showed that this is possible. We can listen to biodiversity. Now, there's loads more work to do in the area, as you can imagine, but the first results were interesting not only in showing that this tool predicts biodiversity, but also the really simple measures were actually the most powerful. And if we think, again, what simple computationally means cheap energetically. So it means that we could potentially run these measures on mobile phones, as we talked about. With some other colleagues in engineering who work normally in autonomous vehicle research, I approached them because I knew that they worked on low-power meshworks. If we're working in the forest, there's no power, there's no phone signal. So how are we going to collect data and get it back to a server? Well, they have those tools. And we made a little prototype to demonstrate that this is possible in principle. And that's ongoing work. So this idea, we actually now want to bring to the second project, which I'm going to tell you about in the last couple of minutes, which is working with the fishing communities in Indonesia to try and help them evidence their coral restoration projects. So we're hoping to turn that into a little buoy network that we can, sorry, not little, huge buoy network that we'll put out over through Indonesia. Indonesia, as you may or may not know, it resides in one of the highest marine biodiversity hotspots of the planet. There's a common theme here. But a third, in a recent survey, they've noticed that a third of the coral is in bad condition, and another third is in serious decline. The good news, again, is that there are numerous community projects exploring methods for reef restoration, and there are global initiatives to support this. But once again, we need evidence. There's simply not enough marine biologist expertise in Indonesia to go and survey the 17,000 islands that are there. But there are a lot of fishermen who would happily stop doing cyanide fishing, which they're currently doing for the illegal aquarium trade, and collect data for us to support reef restoration. But if the methods were meaningful to them, right? So you're probably familiar, some of you may be familiar with the sound that you heard at the beginning of this talk. It's the sound that we might be familiar with if we've been snorkeling or diving. It's the sound of snapping shrimps. And they stun their prey with bubbles, making this little crackling sound. And very simply, they live on healthy reef, and they don't really live on unhealthy reef, and they don't live where there's no reef. So we have a very, very simple acoustic measure of reef health. More noise, more healthy reef. Okay? So we're working with communities in Sulawesi, in West Papua, and North Bali at the moment to trial these methods and co-develop the way that we can use both sound and cheap cameras to make 3D imaging of coral reef as a tool that they can use to evidence their own conservation projects. Now, I find all of these ideas kind of intellectually and technically really exciting, and it's quite pleasing to be able to be involved in a project that can be potentially useful in bringing us back from the brink, that being too dark. But sometimes I have concerns about kind of imposing our ideas and our technologies on other people's and other people's ways of doing things. I was visiting this community at Christmas. We went out for a pilot to test the equipment and to build partners. And it was raining so heavily we couldn't go diving. So I sat playing cards with this guy from Sulawesi and was just chatting to him. And I said, well, what do you think? Do you think this can work? Do you think it's got legs? Do you think we can use sound to monitor the reef? And he looked at me and he said, yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, when we go fishing at night, we want to know where the fish are. The fish live on the reef. We just put the oar on our ear and we listen for the crackling sound like raining. Then the reef is here. And this made my heart sing because I'd arrived here from evolutionary theory and big data and loads of numbers and multivariate stats. And he had learnt this from his granddad, and he knew this. So this to me feels really promising when these methods that are age-old can be applied to the problems that people have now and find these solutions. And in a more kind of epistemological sense, I find when theoretical predictions and empirical data and traditional ways of knowing all collide, then I think we're onto a good idea, and hopefully one that can help create a better world for people and for planet. Thank you very much.